Bem, boa tarde a todas, boa tarde a todos, aos que estão aqui presentes, também saúdo quem nos assiste de casa, espero que nos assistam em um futuro um pouco melhor do que esse que a gente vai discutir aqui nesse momento. Né? Estamos aqui reunidos, então, em mais um plantão das Relações Internacionais, com essa árdua missão de debater agendas que muitas vezes são duras, né? Que permeiam o nosso campo. Então, daí a motivação para pararmos essa semana para refletir sobre a situação na faixa de Gaza, uma situação, né, já bastante duradoura e que da semana passada para cá se inflamou, nos levando aí a fazer considerações mais profundas a respeito. Sempre comento com as turmas, acho que todos aqui foram alunos de introdução, eu salvo engano, né, pelos rostinhos, e algo que me assusta, mas ao mesmo tempo me motiva, é ver o quanto o curso de Relações Internacionais é procurado quando existem questões globais duras. Um dia precisamos fazer uma pesquisa sobre isso, professores, Dani, Rashmi, porque é impressionante o volume de estudantes que se inscrevem, né, para o nosso curso, quando questões difíceis no plano internacional se desdobram, né, a semelhança no vestibular de 2002, né, dos atentados do 11 de setembro, foi a turma que eu entrei, foram 2 turmas, inclusive, tamanho, volume de alunos, a crise de 2008, Trump no poder, a crise russo-ucraniana no passado e agora essa situação em Gaza. Mas, apesar disso, por um lado, né, trazer esse fardo de lidarmos com temas que são de difícil digestão, me enche de esperança ver que jovens querem entender a respeito e, eu suponho, fazer algo a respeito. Né? Então, acho muito motivador ver vocês se engajarem com essas agendas, que por mais que sejam agendas distantes de nós fisicamente, nos conectam como humanos, né? Então, cabe aí a reflexão. E aí, hoje nós temos o prazer de contar com 2 professores do departamento, que são grandes especialistas no assunto. Aliás, o nosso departamento, vejo o professor Rodrigo aqui, que eu não havia cumprimentado também, o saúdo. Acho que nós poderíamos fazer uma sequência assim, de 7 dias, né? 24 horas, porque temos muitos especialistas aí em segurança, professor Rodrigo, professor Jorge, professor Eugênio, professor Cristiano, professora Geraldine. Mas hoje tivemos a sorte de termos coincidido na casa o professor Dani Zarredin, que é doutor pela PUC Minas, pelo Departamento de Geografia, também se dedica, né, aos estudos sobre o Oriente Médio e preside o grupo de estudos sobre o Oriente Médio e Magrebe, o GEOM. Né, deixo aqui o convite para vocês acompanharem o trabalho do grupo. E a professora Rashmi Singh, doutora pela London School of Economics, que se dedica ao terrorismo e tem também uma pesquisa voltada ao grupo Hamas, né, que foi objeto da sua tese doutoral, né, professora? Então, também tem acompanhado a questão de forma muito próxima e dirige a TRAC, que é uma rede de pesquisas aqui da universidade sobre terrorismo, crime organizado. Então, fica aqui o convite aos alunos e às alunas e a quem nos assiste de casa para acompanhar também as pesquisas dos professores por meio dessas redes. Bem, sem mais delongas, vou convidá-los aqui, então, para compor a nossa mesa e começar a conversa de hoje. Professor Dani, professora Rashmi, sejam muito bem-vindos. Nós vamos fazer esse formato de uma exposição, seguida de perguntas, então peço para que vocês aguardem um pouquinho para encaminhar as dúvidas, tá bom? Obrigada, professores.
Boa tarde a todas e todos. Alegria estar, né, nessa tarde de hoje com vocês, com aqueles que nos acompanham à distância. Alegria também estar com a professora Rashmi Singh, colega aqui do departamento e amiga, para discutir um tema tão importante, né, que são os desdobramentos daquilo que aconteceu no dia 7 de outubro. Então, sem mais delongas, né, vou passar a palavra e agradecer também o convite feito pela professora Daniela, né, para participar desse plantão RI. Achei a iniciativa extremamente importante. Geralmente, a academia ela tem uma velocidade diferente, né? Nós temos ali uma capacidade de responder a determinados fenômenos conjunturais de uma maneira um pouco mais lenta. A mídia nos encaminha para dar essas respostas, né? Então, achei muito interessante a iniciativa do departamento, né, do curso aqui da Praça da Liberdade, de trazer essa resposta tão rápida. Então, passo a palavra para a professora Rashmi para a exposição acerca do Hamas e acerca dos fatos ocorridos nos últimos dias.
Muito obrigada. Good afternoon, and I will start off by saying that it's a pleasure to be here, and it's even more of a relief to be able to speak about this in English. I have a lot of ground to cover, so if I speak in English, it's just faster. And I hope a little bit more intelligible than my Portuguese. So thank you very much for your interest and your presence. Danny, vou pedir você marcar a hora para mim, até mais ou menos meia hora. Me dá só 10 minutos antes da meia hora para ver exatamente onde estou, tá? Obrigado, viu? Okay, so let's start. Harakat al-Muqawwa al-Islamiyah, or Hamas, easier, right? Everybody is talking about this because of the recent attacks in Israel. And the attacks have been absolutely terrible. I was speaking about this earlier this morning in terms of the violence levels of this attack. We haven't seen this level of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since the Second Intifada and the campaign of suicide attacks that was led by Hamas as well as other organizations. We are seeing a distinct shift in tactics in terms of hostage taking, which Hamas has never done before. They've only had 3 incidences before this, starting in '94, then again in 2014, and then again a couple of years after 2014 with hostages. It's not a policy. So it's unclear right now if hostages that have been taken were taken because of a decision by the combatants on the ground, or it was a decision and a directive coming from the leadership. If it is a directive from the leadership, we are seeing some very dark times ahead of us in terms of the change in tactics. The number of people dead now is over 1,000. It's horrific. I would even say that we have not seen a terrorist attack of this scale since 9/11. So my condolences go out, heartfelt condolences go out to all of those people who have been impacted by this attack, because it is terrible. However, I will also say that the history of this attack does not go back 10 days. To understand why these attacks happen, we have to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is exactly what I'm going to try to do in the very short time that I have with you today. So let's see if this works. Maybe not. There we go. The other direction. So this is what I'm going to try to do very, very quickly in the time that I have. I'm not going to go into the details, but what I have to remind you is that this conflict goes back 70 years. The conflict, you can argue, even goes back in terms of its roots to the rise of Zionism in the late 1800s. So before the before the 20th century, when the idea with the rise of Zionism, which is political Judaism, was to not only have the religion of Judaism, but also to have a territory associated with that religion. We see this in various other religions. We see this in terms of political Islam, most obviously, but we also see right now political Hinduism, for instance, in India. With the right-wing Modi government. It is not to say that political religions are only right-wing. We have the full spectrum. But just to understand Zionism, it is about the establishment of a Jewish state for Jewish people. So it's not only a territory, and a religion, but a territory associated with that religion. So we get to the end of the First World War, and at the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire in this region fragments. This area becomes part of a British colony called the British Mandate of Palestine, where the British have a deliberate support for the establishment of a Jewish state in this space. There is also, I would also add, already an Arab Jewish population in this area since ancient times because of Jerusalem. It is an area also with other Muslims, Shia, Sunni, Christians, and so it's a fairly mixed group already. But starting with the establishment of the British Mandate, we see a distinct policy backed by the British to assist the establishment of a Jewish presence, mostly a European Jewish presence in this area. And that is followed by a series of aliyahs or immigrations that are essentially from Europe into this area. We skip forward quite a few generations or quite a few decades, and what we have is increasing Arab resistance against European Jewish presence here, because one of the things that is happening with the presence of the Jewish population here, and I think I would already start by saying the Zionist population, not just the Jewish, because it's a population that is interested in the establishment of a Jewish state, which is very different from just any Jew. So with the increasing Zionist population in the area, one of the things that we are beginning to see is the establishment of the Jewish National Fund buying contiguous land to establish Jewish or Zionist presence in that area. And this is essentially what gets us through various revolts, through various movements, all the way to the Second World War. By the time we're getting to the rise, the start of the Second World War, the British in this area are under immense pressure. So much pressure that they now ban any kind of Jewish immigration into this region, which is a bit of a mess considering there is a Holocaust happening in Europe. I mean, this is the worst time to ban immigration if they were going to do this, right? And so what we see is the rise of various Jewish militias in the region, using terrorism against the British colonial state. So now the British are under siege, not only from the Arab population, which is very upset with them and their policies, but also the Jewish side of the population. And at this point, they basically decide to leave. And this is the situation that gets us to UN Resolution 181. What we have here is the United Nations plan for the partition of Palestine, the British Mandate of Palestine, into 2 states. As you can see, like all things associated with the United Nations, it was brilliantly planned. Over here is the area that was given to the Zionists, the Jewish population. And these 2 spaces were supposed to be essentially Palestinian. They're very, I mean, there's a slight inaccuracy in this map, but it gives you a clear idea, more or less. In the middle over here, as you can see, is Jerusalem, which is a lightning rod issue for this conflict. And Jerusalem was given to international protection and administration and to be resolved later on. The Palestinian Arab population rejected the plan, and they rejected the plan because for them, the Israeli presence, or I should say Zionist, because Israel was still not a creation at this point, the Zionist presence in the region for them was nothing more than one more colonial presence that had been imposed on this region by the British colonial powers. And so they rejected this and demanded the rest of mandatory Palestine. And that was the point that the war between the 2 sides started. The result of the war, let's see, does this move? Here we go. The result of this war was not a 2-state solution. And maybe I can take one more step forward to give you, let's not do that. The result of the war was not a 2-state solution. In fact, if we move backwards, a lot of this territory that was assigned for the Arab state was essentially taken by the Israeli state. What we had for Israel as a moment of triumph, a moment of celebration, and especially in the wake of the genocide that was the Holocaust, was a Nakba, or a tragedy or catastrophe, literally translated, for the Palestinians, because it created a situation where they not only did not have a state or a state identity, they also created a situation of mass immigration and refugee status. So what we had was huge flows of refugees out of the areas that were captured by the Israeli forces and incorporated into the Israeli state beyond the resolution as decided by the UN. and the creation of a series of refugee camps, not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. The other refugee camps emerged in the neighboring countries, everywhere from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. So what you have, for example, just to give you an idea, 7 million Palestinians live outside the territories of Palestine today. A lot of these are in refugee camps, and they have been since 1948. The other great crisis that happened that created more influx of refugees was 1967 and the Six-Day War. But going back sorry, the other way again. Going back to this set, what we have is a series of crises then between the Arab nations and the Palestinians on the one side, and Israel on the other. I will make a distinction here. The Arab-Israeli crisis is not the same as the Palestinian-Israeli crisis. The Palestinian crisis is but one part of a broader conflict between the Arab states and the Israeli state. However, it is at one level, perhaps the core of the problems between these countries. But from here, as you can see, there was a series of wars. For us, 1967 is particularly important, and the reason of that is in this map over here. In 1967, Israel essentially occupied territory that very little of this territory has been returned to the Arab nations or the people it belonged to, despite international conventions and demands for that, and despite it being illegal under international law. In 1967, the two areas that Israel got control of was Gaza and West Bank. Why does that make no sense? Because I didn't tell you one thing very interesting in 1948. Gaza and West Bank did not emerge as independent states in 1948. Gaza became part of the Egyptian state, and Jordan took West Bank. There was no Palestine, okay? And those two territories were regained by Israel in 1967, as you can call, or perhaps regained is the wrong word, but taken over, occupied by Israel in 1967. And that was the first time these two territories came under direct Israeli control, a direct Israeli occupation. The other two spaces that was actually taken by Israel in 1967 were the Golan Heights, as you can see in the north, which is pointed out. This part of Golan still remains, again, despite international law, part of the Israeli territory and under Israeli occupation. The fourth area was the Sinai Peninsula that belonged to Egypt in the south, which you can see over here, which was actually returned as part of the Land for Peace Agreement and as a result of the Camp David Accords and a unilateral peace between Egypt and Israel, mediated by the United States in the early 1980s. So this is a situation that gets us to the 1980s, a population under occupation, a population that is extremely frustrated, is harassed on a daily basis, has it's basically martial law in both of these spaces, Gaza and the West Bank. And that is what gives rise to a level of frustration in the Palestinian population that gives us the first Intifada in 1987. And this takes the world by surprise, but it also takes other Palestinian political parties by surprise. They never saw it coming, okay? It literally is a grassroots movement. Intifada means shaking. And it's really the population rising up and protesting. And they start by protesting how? They start boycotting Israeli goods. They stop paying taxes. They are peaceful protests. But then there is also violent protest, except it's violent in the sense of they are boys and girls with stones standing in front of tanks, because Israel has one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and the other side doesn't have a military, doesn't have a police, and is basically unarmed. You've had armed groups in this space before, and this is the time there is a sort of a resurgence as well as the emergence of Hamas. Hamas emerges in 87, 88 with the first Intifada. It is got its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, which emerges in Egypt, opens its branch in Palestine to fight for independence in 1928, and has always had a presence there since 1928. The Egyptian Brotherhood is very interesting, as is the Muslim Brotherhood in all its branches, because there is one thing that is in common: Dawa wal Tabligh. The logic of the Muslim Brotherhood is the reformation of Islamic society, of Muslim society. The logic is there is colonialism in the Middle East because Muslims have lost the true path of Islam. And therefore, the way to remove colonialism and penetration, external penetration, is to return to the path of true Islam. Originally, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a violent organization, but as it develops, as it has ideologues like Sayyid Qutb, violence certainly becomes part and parcel of it. And so when the Intifada breaks out in the Palestinian territories, the Muslim Brotherhood that is present there doesn't want to lose out. So they create a military branch called Hamas, with the assistance, interestingly enough, in Gaza of Israel, because Israel is interested in weakening the PLO. And so what we have now is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood participating in the Intifada, with the Muslim Brotherhood buffered from any kind of harsh Israeli response, except things don't go according to plan, neither for the Muslim Brotherhood and neither for Israel, because Hamas becomes extremely strong and extremely important, and they take over. So there is no Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine anymore. There is Hamas, okay? And so this is the situation that gives us Hamas. As we move forward, and I just want to show you this, just to give you an idea. This is an old map. This is 1999. You can see how the conflict has essentially resulted in a complete and absolute loss of land for the Palestinian side. And this is why we have, as you can see, 1999, you know, that's the end of the Oslo Peace Accords. You had Intifada, not only the first, by the time you get to the 2000s, you had the second Intifada. And so what we have here is, just to give you a visual of the first Intifada, what it looks like. Like I said, you know, children, boys and girls with stones standing in front of one of the strongest militaries in the world. The emergence of Hamas, that is the Hamas flag. And one of the things that we see here, when Hamas emerges, you know, it uses the Muslim Brotherhood's charity institutions, because, you know, Muslim Brotherhood is about education. It is about converting people to a truer path of Islam. So it's all about social service, hospitals, schools, judo clubs, football clubs, you know, in a space that there is nothing. Hamas inherits that, and it uses that to get the popular support of the population in West Bank as well as Gaza. But, you know, it has a very, very clear structure. And from the very beginning, what we see, and this is already prior to the Oslo Peace Accords, which I will get to in a second, what we are seeing is Hamas has this fantastic mechanism of combining violence and non-violence. And it does not only use this against Israel, its key enemy, it uses it against anybody it declares an enemy, including other Palestinians and other Palestinian groups. So in terms of its non-violent strategies, it provides food, medicine, education, financing, the reconstruction of houses, because there is a Israeli policy of demolishing houses in the Palestinian territories. It helps refugee camps and all sorts of various clubs. But it also has all these categories of violent activity. Hamas was the first group in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to use suicide attacks in 1992. And it carried on the use of these suicide attacks towards 2006, 2007. That's the last time we saw a campaign of suicide attacks in the territories. But it has also engaged in rocket attacks, knife attacks, specifically against settlers and in the West Bank, and previously in Gaza before 2005, when there was a unilateral withdrawal of all settlers. Detentions, and we see this very clearly, executions, torture and beatings, and house arrests. Just to give you an idea, and we will get there, but when Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, the number of people with, I don't know how you say, shot out kneecaps went up from 0 to 60% in a week's time, just to give you an idea. The other place, by the way, that has a conflict with lots of shot out kneecaps is evidently Ireland. So the Irish doctors are the best to reconstruct in case you need some help with your knees. And so this gets us to the Oslo Peace Accords. You know, by the time we get to the end of the First Intifada, there is international intervention. There is the sense that, you know, this has to come to an end, this conflict. And so we have a mediated peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Israelis are represented by Rabin, who was center left, and the Palestinians are represented by Yasser Arafat, the old leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I do not have the time to go into the details of this. Just to give you an idea, the PLO is an umbrella organization that has various other groups under it. The biggest of these groups has been Fatah, which has been the party of Yasser Arafat. It is still the party that is one of the largest in the Palestinian territories. And with the Oslo Peace Accords, the PLO for the first time was recognized by the Israeli state as a partner in negotiations. Prior to this, the PLO was seen as a terrorist organization, and Israel does not negotiate with terrorists, okay? And so that was what the Oslo Peace Accords did. But the Oslo Peace Accords also did one more thing. They turned the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or at least a part of it, into the Palestinian National Authority, which would be the group, the legitimate governmental representative of the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza as part of this two-state solution. So the PA is not the same as the PLO. The PLO still exists. What is the difference? The PA is the legitimate representative of Palestinians in the territories of Gaza and West Bank, while the PLO is the legitimate representative of Palestinians irrespective of where they may be in the world.
Rashmi.
Okay? 10 minutes? Okay. And so this is what gets us to the Oslo Peace Accords. But the Oslo Peace Accords don't really do much. They fail, and the result of that is a second intifada. But the Oslo Peace Accords gave us something that is really important to talk about. We are talking, for example, right now about a Gaza that is in control by Hamas and a West Bank that is controlled by the Palestinian National Authority. That's not quite correct. Yes, Gaza is controlled by Hamas, but the West Bank has been split, thanks to the Oslo Peace Accords, into Area A, B, and C. Area A is basically areas of high Arab or Palestinian population densities. And this is administered directly by the Palestinian Authority. The gray area, the area B, is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, but is co-controlled by Israel, especially when it comes to security. So it's all martial law, okay? All area A and B, especially B, is martial law. When you're looking at area C, that's over 60% of the West Bank that is controlled by Israel, no Palestinian Authority, and that is controlled by the laws and the legislatures of Israel. This is actually part of Judea and Samaria in terms of legislative, administrative institutions and provinces. And where you see area C, the green area, that is where we have the highest density of settlers. At this point, there are more settlers in Area C than there are Palestinians. And what we are seeing in Area C, since the establishment of direct control in 1967, is a very clear and slow annexation of the land, the division of Palestinian areas into Bantustans or islands of territory. So now you're beginning to see the problem with a two-state solution, because you do not really have commitment from the Israeli side in terms of a two-state solution. So we are going forward. Al-Aqsa Intifada, we get to the end of the Oslo Peace Accords, they fail, there is a lot of frustration. And then you have a trigger, Arian Sharon, the so-called butcher of Shabra and Shatila, a refugee camp in Lebanon, decides this is the best time to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque with over 100 Israeli policemen. The Palestinians protest his entering the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. There is rioting, the police shoots, we have deaths, and that is the spark that you need for the second intifada. The second intifada goes from 2000 to 2006, and this is where we see the highest incidences of suicide attacks against the Israeli state, against Israeli civilians. It is led by Hamas, but you also have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and you also have groups like Fatah, who are technically secular, now joining the bandwagon of suicide attacks because they cannot be left behind in terms of legitimacy because the Palestinians are so absolutely frustrated. And so we get from there to 2006 in the legislative elections. Hamas takes part in the legislative elections and wins. Aha. Except look at that. Look at that, the margin of victory here. But the results are rejected by the United States, Israel, and European countries, because democracy works only when you get the results you want, okay? And unfortunately, and I have said this repeatedly, this was the greatest mistake we could have made in counterterrorism, because Hamas was basically not allowed to govern when it won the elections. So this was a complete loss of legitimacy for those who are talking about a two-state solution and democracy. But it also was a stupid move, because data shows us, you know, the way to make a terrorist organization not be a terrorist organization, put them to govern a place. When they have to pick up litter and clean the place and provide schools, they actually don't have that much time to do terrorism. So perhaps we would have seen a different situation if we had not had the reaction that we did. But the result of that was the split between West Bank and Gaza, okay? In 2007, the Palestinian Authority essentially split between Hamas taking over Gaza and the Palestinian Authority staying in control of the West Bank. This is, in the Palestinian history of its independence movement, perhaps the greatest blow to the movement because of this division between these two spaces. These two spaces are already physically divided. They have had different trajectories of evolution when it comes to the independence movement. But this, perhaps, in terms of this division between Hamas in one space and the Palestinian Authority in the other, was the greatest that we could have imagined in this space. So this gets us, and I'm going to take a little bit of my extra 30 minutes to go over the rest of these slides really, really quickly. Gaza has been under blockade for the last 16, 17 years now, okay? 2007, and you know, one of the things that we don't talk about is the blockade is not only land blockade, it's also a blockade of the sea. That means how far Palestinian fishermen can actually enter the waters is determined by the blockade. You cannot do any deep sea fishing. In other words, it is an absolute stranglehold on this territory, okay? Since 2008, there have been 4 wars against Gaza. And that does not include this one, which is the 5th. And that does not include other incidences, other operations. For example, the very, very harsh Israeli response to the 2018 non-violent protests, but we will get there. So Gaza Strip really has nowhere to go, as you can see. You can see the boundaries here. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I really want to go over these slides quickly. This gives you an idea of the other side in terms of if you look at the water, you can see to some extent how far the water blockade goes. But also, I'm not sure how clear it is for you. What you can see in the 5 provinces of Gaza, so North Gaza, Gaza City, Deir al-Belah, Khan Yunis, and Rafah, you can see very, very clearly what are the concentrations of populations, and the majority of the population is in the north. The reason for this, by the way, is till at least 2005, the south was actually occupied by settlements. And I will show you that in a second. You can see here the area that has been marked out for evacuation. It is one of it basically includes the north of Gaza and Gaza City, which are the 2 top provinces. And these are the most heavily populated spaces in Gaza City. In Gaza, the Gaza Strip. And so this is important. It's also important to remember this is not a very large territory. It's about, you know, the size of Belo Horizonte, more or less. And you still have you know, spaces. These are all sort of, the red areas are all no-go spaces because they're security spaces. The Deir al-Balah, which is this province over here, is where you have the most agriculture. It's also where the electric power plant is, which is now doesn't have any electricity, any fuel. It's important to also understand that when there is crops grown in this area, there are rules and regulations as to the height of the crop. So no crops can be grown above a certain meter because it impedes visibility of the Israeli army on the other side of the fence. You can understand what this is doing in terms of economic strangulation of the population, even down to what they can and cannot grow. Again, I will emphasize this. This is not about excusing Hamas terrorist activity, but you cannot understand the roots of Hamas, why Hamas is also a political party, until you understand the roots of conflict and the fact that this is an occupation underway. And not only is it a complete and absolute occupation of Gaza, it is a complete and absolute occupation and sort of progressive annexation of territory in the West Bank. Unless you can understand this frustration, you cannot understand these recent attacks, and therefore you cannot understand the conflict. Moving forward, just to give you an idea, 2008 was the first time Gaza had an attack, Operation Cost-led, 47,000 homes, more than 1,440 Palestinian killed, 920 civilians. 2012, 167 Palestinians, 87 civilians. Operation Pillar of Defense. 2014, do you remember the Israeli soldier that was taken hostage? That was 2014. Span of 50 days, 2,100 Palestinians killed, around 1,400 civilians, close to 500 children. March 2018 to December 2019, this was the Great March of Return. Okay, this is a non-violent protest that was essentially peaceful protests near the border on every Friday, trying to ask the world to pay attention, open the border, stop the blockade, the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and the protest against the US recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's official capital. And that was responded to with overwhelming force as well. Okay, again, I'm not comparing victims and pains and deaths, but this is not one-sided violence, all right? Hamas's tunnels. So what is happening? The other thing that we need to talk about, Hamas has used quite a lot of time of the blockade building this very nice network of tunnels. So all the bombardment that is happening right now is essentially killing civilians because you're not getting to, especially the 30, 40 meter deep tunnels. Hamas doesn't need to be on the ground to move across the north of the Gaza Strip or in the Khan Yunis province. It has this intricate system of tunnels. Israel is also, and this is something to consider, one of the reasons Israel is not interested in a ground assault until it really carpet bombs the area is because it basically means they're going to enter a situation of guerrilla warfare, urban guerrilla warfare. The last time the Israeli army was in a situation of this kind of warfare was over 20, 30 years ago. The last time they had urban guerrilla warfare with Hezbollah in 2006, they didn't come out so well. Okay, so it's about capabilities, and this is not something that is going to be easy for the Israelis if they do go in. I'm not going to go into this, but just to give you an idea, what are some of the key competitors for Hamas? Fatah, PA, Israel. They have other challenges. So we've heard about Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas have a long history of cooperation and competition. There are also lots of traditional families and clans in Gaza that have been very powerful over the many decades. The first thing Hamas did was disarm them when it took Gaza in 2007, but they still exert a lot of influence. So this gets us to the end of this. Let's get this open for some questions. I think I tried to cover as much as I could. Hopefully this was clear. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, professora Rashmi, pela excelente exposição. Uma missão quase impossível, né? Fazer um trajeto de 1948 até 2023. Então, eu acho que foi muito importante porque mostrou um pouco as causas, né, profundas daquele conflito. Vou falar 5 minutinhos antes da gente abrir para as questões, para dizer sobre como eu estou preocupado com a situação que vive a região hoje. E eu sou muito realista com relação às escaladas, né? E o que eu vejo acontecendo hoje no Oriente Médio é algo que me traz muita preocupação por 4 dimensões. A primeira, que foi bem colocada pela professora Rashmi, que é a da ocupação prolongada de terra palestina. A segunda questão, a ascensão de uma outra força política na Palestina, que vai rivalizar com outro grupo secular, que é o Hamas, né? O Hamas que vai rivalizar com o Fatah, e que, de certa forma, traz um elemento de disputa entre os palestinos. O terceiro elemento são as disputas internas dentro de Israel, que hoje é um país ultra dividido entre uma esquerda fragilizada, fraca, uma centro-direita em ascensão e uma extrema-direita no poder. E isso, de certa forma, mostra o porquê das ações que aquele Estado tem tomado até agora. E a última dimensão é da própria política internacional e da geopolítica mundial, em que nós também vivenciamos um processo de ascensão de outras forças mundiais, um processo de estagnação e de falha na condução da liderança global praticada pelos Estados Unidos, o que abre espaço para outras forças regionais atuarem, né? Nós vimos nas últimas semanas algo muito impressionante, porque a gente sempre observa, quando falamos sobre Irã e Arábia Saudita, que eram, assim, rivais mortais, né? Rivais mortais. Já trocaram embaixadores, já trocaram telefonemas, eu acho que até bilhetes já trocaram. Então, isso em razão, não de uma questão de momento, mas de uma avaliação clara de um aliado muito próximo dos americanos, que é a Arábia Saudita, que a presença e a liderança dos Estados Unidos no Oriente Médio não era mais a mesma. E isso tem mudado muito o jogo na região. E eu vejo que o Hamas percebe essas coisas todas, percebe que a aproximação de Israel com a Arábia Saudita era algo muito negativo para a sua posição política, a terceira dimensão, a segunda dimensão, e ele vai, então, tentar mudar a perspectiva de que os acordos de Abraão eram acordos importantes para estabilizar a região. Eu acho que essa é uma razão para ele agir como agiu, e o problema é que a resposta de Israel também vai ser uma resposta complicadíssima, porque o governo quer se manter no poder, mas, como bem disse a professora Rashmi, uma inserção por terra, o que pode acontecer nas próximas horas ou nos próximos dias, ela é extremamente custosa para Israel e para os palestinos, mas a extrema-direita ela quer mostrar que é capaz de assegurar aos israelenses uma paz adequada. E nesse contexto todo, quando nós temos a realidade política palestina, a realidade política israelense, a presença e a frustração dos palestinos por mais de 70 anos de terra ocupada e um mundo em transição, a combinação de todos esses elementos aponta para algo que é um pouco difícil de prever o que pode acontecer amanhã. E como nós somos todos estudiosos da história, né? A Primeira Guerra aconteceu mais ou menos assim, a Segunda Guerra aconteceu mais ou menos assim, e há de se ter muita tranquilidade para que os tomadores de decisão das grandes potências possam tomar as próximas decisões, né? Eu vou abrir para blocos de 3 perguntas, quem quiser se manifestar. Deixa eu passar. Só falar o nome e fazer a pergunta.
Meu nome é Lucas Sena. Eu queria perguntar, professora, em relação a uma questão mais institucional, a gente viu ontem a medida do CSNU, que é o órgão institucional mais referente a questões de segurança e de tomada de decisões efetivas no conflito internacional, e a gente tem medidas em que potências como os Estados Unidos vão vetar e vão estar barrando ações assim. A minha pergunta é em relação, então, quais ações de instituições internacionais podem tomar lugar do CSNU, considerando a questão do veto ou se a gente sempre vai ficar à mercê de considerações das Nações Unidas e com poderes de posições assim já tão estabelecidas.
That's a... Oh.
Boa tarde, professora. Meu nome é Maísa. Voltando à questão da faixa de Gaza, a minha pergunta é: como está tendo toda essa exposição na faixa de Gaza atualmente e está expondo a situação precária que essas pessoas vivem? Há um tempo atrás eu tinha visto uma internacionalista fazendo uma crítica falando que parecia um campo de concentração aberto. E foi uma das situações mais precárias que ela achava que tinha acontecido desde o tempo do Holocausto. E eu queria saber a sua opinião do porquê que essa situação ela ainda acontece, tipo assim, no sentido de que é tão precária que, na minha opinião pessoal, em algum momento teria de forma decaída ou seria insustentável, chegaria a ser insustentável, mas não é a situação, é uma situação que acontece há muito tempo, continua acontecendo, e a gente não tem nenhum tipo de previsão ou nenhum tipo de ideia de algo que possa ajudar ou vir como alguma ajuda. Então, eu queria saber como que essa situação se sustenta até hoje e por que, de certa forma, ela é vista como algo legal e algo que não é uma preocupação dentro da agenda nacional. Obrigada.
Boa tarde, meu nome é Helena. Então, eu tenho, na verdade, uma série de coisas para perguntar, mas eu vou tentar resumir um pouco. Por exemplo, ele falou do conselho, né, que teve ontem, tudo, do veto dos Estados Unidos, que já foi até protestado pelo Conselho de Direitos Humanos. Assim, com toda a questão política que acontece dentro de Israel, que eu acredito que é um dos motivos pelos quais Israel vai ficar um pouco mais rígido na questão de concessão, né, para o cessar-fogo e tudo, eu quero saber, assim, primeira coisa, se essa questão, por exemplo, da mídia, por parte, assim, CNN falam absurdos e tudo sempre focado, né, na vitimização um pouco de Israel e etc., e se isso é uma certa forma do governo do Netanyahu tirar o foco principal, né, eu acho que são 2/3, né, da população que queriam que ele caísse, assim, e como que, de certa forma, a diplomacia pode agir para fazer um acordo que seja interessante para o cessar-fogo de ambos os lados, tendo em vista toda a questão governamental que acontece dentro do país e que eu acho que é, de certa forma, tentando tirar o foco do governo dele, né? Opinião pessoal. Obrigada.
Okay. I will say I've been doing interviews for the last 10 days, and these are some of the best questions I've got. Okay. So, yeah, students. Okay. So, difficult questions, and there are no straight answers. There's no straight answer for any one of those. So starting with Lucas, Lucas, it's a very, very important question. It's an absolute shame that we are seeing the United States veto such an important issue that has been tabled in front of the United Nations Security Council, and that too on the lamest pretext that it does not include Israel's right of self-defense. I mean, it is shameful. It is absolutely shameful. And not only is it shameful now, we should be crying and protesting against this sort of a behavior from the United Nations and the United States on the back of 70 years of this conflict, because it is not helping the Palestinians and it is not helping the Israelis either. What we need is committed international intervention for this conflict to be resolved without leaving the Palestinians in a worse situation, humanitarian crisis-wise, and not leaving the Israelis with a state that has, over the last 20, 30 years, essentially become extremely intolerant of a moderate centrist left stance. I mean, if you see Israeli politics, the last 30 years, we've seen the decimation of the Israeli left. We've seen the decimation of moderates. And that is what groups like Hamas play off. They know that they're going to get the kind of response that they have. And that is, you know, the groups like Hamas are going to stay in power. And if it's not Hamas, it'll be another group that is more extreme with another name that is going to stay in power on the altar of the blood of Palestinian people and on the altar of this two-state solution. And we need real intervention from countries like the United States, the European Union, the BRIC countries, with the force of real ideological, military, financial commitment, which we have not seen. Because what we see are platitudes. We have the United Nations and various other countries expressing regret, expressing dismay at what is happening. But when it comes to this situation, we never see anything more concrete than regret. And unless that changes, and that is entirely on the United States, it's entirely on the European Union countries, there is not going to be any kind of change. What we see, therefore, is the extreme right in Israel using this to essentially further its own very, very nefarious agenda. So what we have are radicals and terrorists on both sides of the fence right now. And I will say that very, very strongly, because we have terrorism and state terrorism. I will even go as far as to say, if you look at the United Nations Convention of 1948 on the prevention and the punishment of genocide, Israel is basically in breach of the first, second, and third clauses of that convention. You can actually categorize what is happening with the total blockade and the war in Gaza right now as a genocide. So this is beyond counterterrorism, and we know from the history of terrorism and counterterrorism, the moment you have a disproportionate response, as we saw with the United States in 2001, we do nothing more than generate more terrorism, more radicalization, more recruitment. Look at the Middle East in 2001 and look at the Middle East now in 2023. We didn't have Daesh. We didn't have the fragmentation that we are seeing now. So this is not helping anybody's cause. It's certainly not helping Israeli security either. And we need to back down on both sides. And we need intervention, real intervention. So that's the only thing I can say. I have already forgotten the second question. Can we just quickly just scream out the main thing? Sobre a situação da faixa de Gaza, eu não posso falar mais, né? It is not for any reason that this is known as the largest open-air prison in the world. It is a terrible situation. It is economically extraordinarily weak. I hear repeatedly that the people who counter these arguments talk about, for example, Israel issuing work permits for Palestinians. Israel issues 20,000 work permits annually for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. It's got a population of 2.5 million, just to give you an idea. Okay, so I think what we need to do to get away from the polarization that is in this issue is to educate people. You know, it's not about being pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. It's about being pro-humanity on both sides. And that means we need to stop doing what we have. I mean, look at this. We're paying attention to Israel-Palestine now because of what has happened, the horror that has happened in Israel. This is going to go away in 10 days. The media is going to go away and we're back to square one, right? Tourism is back. Gaza is a prison. The annexation of land in the West Bank continues. What has changed, right? It's not enough just to feel sorry for the humanitarian crisis unless we can do something about it. And that means educating, mobilizing, and actually working towards peace beyond the extremists on both sides of the fence. Because one of the things that has happened in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the last 20 years, and I worked on it for over 20 years, is that I don't see the moderates anymore on either side. There's less and less and less space for discussion and talks. And my worry is that as we move forward, if this is not solved with diplomacy and it's not solved with politics, we're just going to see nothing more than more violence and more extremist politics from both sides. So the situation in Gaza is horrendous. It's terrible. There's no space in the world that you can compare it to. And unfortunately, and you know, just to give you an idea, I cannot believe that we are having the conversations that we are having today as if it's normal. Okay, we are talking about evacuating a northern part of a strip of land of over 1 million people to a space that there's nothing, there's no place to go. What are you going to do? You're basically creating another Nakba. Okay, you're asking civilians to evacuate hospitals. Okay, you're asking babies on incubators, elderly who cannot walk, disabled people to somehow transport themselves out in a territory that has barely any infrastructure. There are no roads, there's not enough cars. People have different economic circumstances. It's not that easy, okay? And now you have a problem with the United Nations trying to do something about it, and countries like the United States even vetoing humanitarian aid and humanitarian corridors. And I have a whole thing on humanitarian corridors, because one of the problems with the humanitarian corridor, just to put it in there, is yes, you create a humanitarian corridor, you get people out of Gaza. What is your guarantee that these people will be let back in and not turned into permanent refugees? Because look at the past 70 years. What evidence do we have that they will be allowed back into Gaza? Nothing. There are no guarantees there. So right now, let's just say I'm up to here with the propaganda from both sides. And we need some serious intervention for the humanity on the ground. And last but not the least, can you please shout out your question again? It's a very difficult space for Netanyahu. Now, Netanyahu is a very interesting character. He's been called the man who can survive anything. If he comes back from this, it will be a miracle. And it will be something that is really outside the ordinary for Israel. Because if you look at the history of Israeli wars and conflict, no government that was in power managed to stay in power after a crisis. So you look at Golda Meir, you look at I think it was Benin in 73. And then again, you have Olmert in 2006. I mean, none of these people, these enormously charismatic leaders, managed to stay in power and government after a crisis. We already know that Netanyahu was besieged before this crisis started. It's absolutely no surprise that we have a unity government in place, because you know, this is this time that all parties are going to come together to deal with the threat, because it's not Hamas that is the threat. You know, Hamas is not the problem. Hamas can chuck as many missiles as it wants. There is no ways that they are going to actually threaten the state of Israel beyond minor damage. The threat is Hezbollah. The threat is Syria. The threat is Iran, okay? We have all sorts of other fronts that can be opened, and that is the problem for Israel. So what is going to be interesting is to see, first of all, how the government holds up once this crisis cools down. I mean, I don't think the Israeli population is going to back down when it comes to the constitutional reforms that Netanyahu has been trying to push forward. But also, it's going to be very, very interesting to see how the investigation around the Hamas attacks is going to evolve. I mean, just for you to understand, this was an attack that went on for a few hours before a response could be properly mounted in a country that is highly militarized. So there's going to be some serious investigations, some very, very hard questions around intelligence failure being asked. And the results of that is going to determine the future of Netanyahu. And so, like I said, I don't want to commit myself to saying that he's going to go away, because he has surprised us before, but it will be a miracle. And then we're going to have to all learn from him in terms of how to reincarnate ourselves if he survives this. I'm not seeing humanity in the conflict. And I think what Netanyahu is going to try to do is he's going to try to use this wave of anger and feeling of revenge that is very, very natural to happen after the kind of terrorist attack we have seen, to consolidate his position. And this is precisely the reason I said that what we are seeing right now has gone beyond counterterrorism. It has gone into genocide. Why? We saw a very, very harsh counterterrorism response from the United States after 2001. The Pew opinion poll results actually had a very interesting series of data that they released, where they asked the American public what they wanted the government to do, and the government was expected to go into Afghanistan. The government was not expected to go into Iraq, but there we have it. But even under the conditions of the global war of terror, on terror, even with a very, very disproportionate response from the United States, we never saw the conditions of genocide created. And let me just explain this to you a little bit, in terms of why I'm saying this repeatedly, and why I don't think Netanyahu is going to go down the path of ceasefire so soon. First of all, when you look at the convention, the UN Convention Against Genocide that I was speaking of, you have 3 clauses. The first clause is special intent. And when you look at the narrative that has been coming out of the Israeli government, from the defense minister calling the Palestinians, not Hamas, calling the Palestinians human animals, from the fact that, various people in the government have said that the objective of this war is not about, specific strikes, but about creating as much damage and, creating as much disruption as possible. There is already special intent in place. The other 2 clauses that you have is the infliction of mental and bodily harm, which we obviously have more than enough evidence for. And the third is to create conditions for the destruction of a people with a particular identity. The total blockade of Gaza, where there is a denial of water, food, electricity or combustibles, and all the other medical equipment that they need, is basically clause number 3. You're creating a situation for the destruction of a people. This has gone beyond counterterrorism. And this is a very, very deliberate strategy. So no, I do not think that Netanyahu's government is going to be very easily accepting a ceasefire till they actually achieve a certain level of stability within Israel. Unfortunately, the price is being paid by the Palestinian civilians. And the problem is that in all our conversations, we are unable to make the distinction between Hamas and Palestinians. To some extent, we can even argue that the Palestinians in Gaza are as much hostage to Hamas as are the hostages that have been taken by them from the Israeli side. So there are no options. There are no options. So, and again, I will go back to the basics of terrorism and counterterrorism. One of the things I teach on a regular basis when we're mounting counterterrorism strategy, the state is always held to a higher standard than the non-state actor. The state has to fight with the principles of just war. That's what separates the state from the terrorist non-state actor. And if you cannot live by the laws of war, then you are no more than a state terrorist actor yourself. And that is a problem when it comes to the expansion and the promotion of violence in the future on all sides.
Mais alguém? Tem mais aqui.
Tá. Por favor, levantem as mãos. Meu Deus. Deixa eu tentar pensar aqui numa representatividade dos períodos. Vou passar para a Luísa do primeiro, que o primeiro ainda não fez uma pergunta, depois eu vou voltando, tá?
Boa tarde. A minha dúvida é em relação ao posicionamento dos países ao redor, né? Nos últimos anos, a gente vê uma aproximação dos países do Oriente Médio com Europa, Estados Unidos, através de evento esportivo, propaganda de turismo, tudo isso. E também em relações políticas, né? Mas com a internet, esse tipo de propaganda sobre Israel fica mais difícil esconder o que tem acontecido, né, na faixa de Gaza ali. E se espera, à medida que o conflito escala, se espera um posicionamento de praticamente todos os países do mundo, mas especialmente ali no Oriente Médio. Eu queria entender um pouco, tem muitos países que já houveram reclamações, tipo a Arábia Saudita, de não se posicionarem veemente contra Israel. Então eu queria entender um pouco a questão do posicionamento deles e como isso pode influenciar tanto na possível escalagem do conflito, quanto também o posicionamento das grandes potências mundiais que também estão se aproximando do Oriente Médio, do dinheiro ali, do petróleo, nesses quesitos.
Boa tarde. Assim, vou tentar ser objetivo, uma pergunta visando assim um possível desdobramento. Como a gente sabe, prever o que vai acontecer amanhã é praticamente impossível, mas a gente tem a história para poder analisar e tentar buscar um caminho. E visto outras questões de conflitos de origem colonial, tal qual agora o conflito Israel-Palestina, a gente pode pegar, por exemplo, o Vietnã, então a libertação da Argélia. Você acredita que seria possível um desdobramento não violento para a libertação do povo palestino nessa disputa colonial? Seria isso?
Pessoal, eu sei que são muitas perguntas, acho que a gente de antemão já se compromete a pensar numa segunda rodada de eventos, né? E convida quem não teve a oportunidade de encaminhar a pergunta que nos envie, por gentileza, a gente pode repassar aos professores e pensar uma forma de retornar, tá bom?
Boa tarde, tudo bem? Então, a minha pergunta é o seguinte, a gente tem um conflito identitário muito forte entre Palestina e Israel, e eu gostaria de saber o que poderia ter sido feito anteriormente pela ONU, pelo Conselho de Segurança, para se reduzir essa segregação identitária. Eu estou sendo um pouco positiva demais até, mas seria possível que se fosse reduzido essa segregação identitária, talvez hoje a gente teria conflitos em uma escalada muito menor?
Okay, thank you for the questions. And I think if you let's do this Mineiro style and go to the Boteco and talk about this. But I think what your question in the back was fantastic, because it's really important to understand the timing of Hamas. Okay, so Hamas has entered into this conflict, and it has instigated this conflict because Hamas, from all its years of existence, has always as its primary goal the objective of being relevant and surviving. And that is the objective at the heart of Hamas's politics. Nothing else will ever come as close to this objective of survival. And so at this time, I mean, there was, of course, a lot of settler and extreme right violence towards individuals in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You know, there's been increasing violence in Jerusalem. That was one of the reasons that Hamas took the action that it did. But much more than that was this process of peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Because that would have made Hamas more or less irrelevant, and it would have put the Palestinian rights to statehood on a back burner, and in a way that perhaps we haven't seen since the unilateral peace between Egypt and Israel. We've had other accords. We've had the Abraham Accords. We've had other Middle Eastern states make peace with Israel, but these are small states. Saudi Arabia is an extraordinarily powerful state in this region, not only in terms of its financial capability, its reputation, its reach, its alliance with the United States, but also because in terms of Islam, your three holiest sites are basically Mecca, Medina, and Al-Quds. So you have Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, and Al-Quds is Arabic for Jerusalem, okay? So your three holiest sites, so you're basically in this peace process saying that the location of the holiest sites in the Middle East is willing to make peace with a state that is technically occupying the third holiest site in Islam. That is a huge, huge statement to be making if you're going into this peace process. And that is exactly what Hamas is overturning. Professor Zahraddin was talking right now about this very interesting diplomatic channel between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Shia and Sunni. And one of the things that they are talking about is Islamic unity and the fact that they have to stand strong and unified in the face of this kind of violence against the Palestinians. It's what Hamas has done with this awful, awful attack is put the Palestinian agenda back on the menu. And it's done it in the most horrific and but most basic way it knows how to not only bring attention to the issue, but remain relevant in there and survive for the next years if it can. And that sort of lets me go to your next question, which I'm going to try to remember. I'm so terrible at this, right? Just scream out loud. Is there going to be a non-violent solution? I would like to think so, yes. You know, one of the things I always say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I've mentioned this to a few of my students recently, and I've said this for a long time, is that if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had started 50 years before it did, so if we had had the establishment of the State of Israel in the 1900s, in sort of 1948, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Okay, it would be another New Zealand, another Australia, another America. It would have been done and dusted, water under the bridge. Okay, what happened in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that it started in terms of identity of Israel and the Palestinians at a time where we were seeing a wave of anti-colonialism around the world in this region. And that's the only reason we're still talking about it. And what we have seen is a lot of violence in this. But I think this is where politics is so tremendously important. You know, we've gone through histories where the colonial state has murdered native populations, erased their memory, their cultural identities, and taken over. We are well past that. And I think the United States, Europe, Israel needs to realize that as well, because, you know, the response of the United States was entirely one-sided. We are no longer in this global order where the global South is no longer heard. And that means that the only way to sustainable peace is a two-state solution, a viable two-state solution, which agrees and understands that the right of Israel to exist is a fundamental right. It is gone because, you know, if you're going to talk about only a Palestine without Israel, you're talking about genocide in reverse. And if you're going to talk about an Israel without Palestine, you're talking about a genocide. So what is the solution? Is international intervention, diplomacy, the establishment of two states, and the recognition and respect of Israel and Palestine as two legitimate entities in this region, irrespective of what history has passed before, irrespective of what territories were owned by who before. And that is the way to nonviolent resolution. And that is what is needed for the peace of these people on both sides. And there was a last. Okay. I have no idea. Just to let you know, there is a United Nations presence in the West Bank. There has been. There is a World Health Organization, Red Cross, OCHA. I mean, you name it, and they are there, and they have been there, and they are helpless in the face of the occupation. Okay, in my own field work, I very clearly remember standing outside Bethlehem in a UN-marked car and waiting there without being allowed in. And I remember asking why we can't just go in. I mean, after all, we are marked as the United Nations. And they said, oh no, we're going to be shot at. Okay. So the reality of occupation, and I will say this forcefully, occupation on the ground is extremely harsh. And it leaves very, very little space for the intervention of international organizations in reality. And therefore, again, the solution is diplomatic, the solution is political, the solution has to be done with real commitment from the international community. Without that, we are not seeing any shifts here.
Permite trabalhar um pouquinho, que eu deixei a professora Rashmi trabalhando muito sozinha, né? E dizer que a questão da solução, né, do problema, ela eu vejo só um caminho, e concordo com a professora Rashmi, que é a solução de 2 estados. Muitos têm apresentado soluções interessantíssimas, né, de um único estado, e que são inviáveis. São inviáveis porque se a solução de um único estado para palestinos e israelenses ela é colocada em prova, nós pensamos aqui que os palestinos terão os mesmos direitos de cidadãos como os israelenses também possuem. Uma vez eu perguntei isso em Israel, né, a um comandante israelense. Falei, olha, acho ótima essa solução de um Estado. Vocês vão dar esse mesmo estado de bem-estar social para os palestinos, que é uma beleza, né? Ele falou, claro que não. Claro que não. E se insistem com essa ideia, a taxa de fecundidade dos palestinos é muito maior do que a taxa de fecundidade dos israelenses, né? E talvez em 15 anos a ideia de um Estado israelense, judeu, né, desapareça, porque a maior parte da população vai ser palestina. Hoje, se nós contarmos o número de palestinos que estão em Gaza, Cisjordânia, Jerusalém Oriental, e de árabes israelenses que são palestinos, né, nós temos quase o mesmo número de israelenses judeus em Israel. Então, já é um balanço demográfico muito complexo. Então, eu só vejo a solução de 2 estados. Mas qual que é o problema? Em 1970, quando o presidente Nasser morre, logo depois de negociar o fim do Setembro Negro ali com o rei Hussein, um ataque cardíaco, né? O vice-presidente, o Sadat, assume. E o Sadat, ele queria negociar a devolução do Sinai, em razão da Guerra de 67. E procurou o secretário de Estado, na época, que era o Henry Kissinger, que era do presidente Nixon, né, o secretário de Estado, e perguntou para o Henry Kissinger, olha, a Golda Meir é muito brava, ela não negocia nada, não deixa fazer nada, estou querendo negociar, vou reconhecer Israel, tal, mas não muda nada, o que vocês podem fazer? E aí o Henry Kissinger disse, eu não posso fazer nada, até que um fato novo apareça. E ele entendeu que ele tinha que fazer uma outra guerra. Em 1973, ele criou um fato novo, uma guerra limitada, tática, para atravessar o canal de Suez e ali infligir dano ao exército israelense, mostrar, nós não estamos mais em 67, estamos em 73, eu sou um elemento inconveniente aqui, e vamos negociar em 88 de volta o Sinai. E eu vejo que não é à toa que 50 anos depois, no dia 7 de outubro, né, no dia ali da guerra do Yom Kippur, acontece o ataque do Hamas, no mesmo dia, né, 50 anos depois, para trazer um fato novo. Ninguém está dizendo que Hamas ia vencer Israel. Aquilo ali é um movimento tático, né? Uma provocação duríssima, terrível para os israelenses, e que trouxe aquela sociedade, né, a uma visão da realidade. Porque Israel é um país desenvolvido, Israel é um país com bem-estar social, e parece que eles vivem assim em um transe. Parece que eles não veem que existem 4 milhões de pessoas aprisionadas ali dentro. E o que aconteceu no dia 7, que foi um horror, né? Uma tragédia, parece que os acordou sobre essa questão. E isso mostra como que a diplomacia é difícil nesse mundo. Ali é difícil, porque a linguagem, infelizmente, que eles entendem, eu falo dos dois lados, é a linguagem da violência. A violência como elemento, né, político. E, infelizmente, talvez, a violência que ocorreu ali e a violência que está sendo perpetrada contra os palestinos, abra a possibilidade, em razão dos desdobramentos políticos que essa mesma violência gerou, abre espaço, não agora, mas em médio prazo, para uma discussão de uma solução que seja mais definitiva, né? Então, é muito doloroso, muito difícil, e vejo que a solução estou tentando ver aqui as perguntas, né? A solução do problema, ela perpassa por um sistema muito, muito amplo e complexo, né? O Egito assinou a paz com Israel logo depois da guerra do Yom Kippur. A Jordânia fez a paz em 1994, 96, e o Egito disse: se Israel forçar palestinos a entrarem aqui no Sinai por meio da violência, isso é um ato de guerra contra o Egito. A Jordânia disse: se Israel forçar palestinos a saírem de Gaza e entrar na Jordânia, isso é um ato de guerra contra a Jordânia. Então, a situação realmente é muito tensa. Sem encontrar o Hezbollah. O ministro da Defesa de Israel disse hoje: olha, o problema é o seguinte, o Hezbollah é 10 vezes mais forte do que o Hamas. E aí nós temos que levar a coisa meio... Nós não queremos briga com o Hezbollah. Mas se tiver que ter, vai ter. Difícil, ruim, mas não quero. Então está tudo no fio da navalha, né? Mas a solução é essa, né, professora? É pensar o seguinte, como disse o Sadat naquele memorável discurso que ele fez no Knesset, quando ele fez a visita surpresa a Israel para apresentar a paz para os israelenses, né? Não é possível a gente viver o sonho da paz sem dar a paz para o outro também, né? Então, eu vejo que Israel vai conseguir, na plenitude da sua competência, né, da comunidade judaica que ofereceu, que tem muito para oferecer do mundo, ele vai chegar nessa plenitude a partir do momento que permitir que os palestinos possam também florescer na plenitude das suas capacidades e da sua cultura, quando tiverem um Estado soberano, vivendo em segurança, né, side by side com os israelenses. É isso. Eu acho que não pode fazer mais pergunta, né? Então, tá bom. Então, agradecer muito a professora Rashmi. Agradecer muito a professora.
Nós colocamos, olha, agora eu voltei. Nós também postamos as contribuições que os professores têm feito sobre o tema, né? Então, convido a todos a acompanhar. Obrigada.